up and down with ecology. Maybe that's not the exact title, but more or less. And Downs argued that everything goes through an issue attention cycle. That people get all fed up about something, they'll bury a Volkswagen as a symbol, tremendous enthusiasm, and then it dies out. But he was wrong about the environment. And why was he wrong about the environment? Because it became institutionalized. The EPA was formed. Why Richard Nixon did this is still somewhat of a mystery. A lot of environmental groups took on much more of a strictly environmental role instead of just let's protect one critter or another. And this has made a huge difference. So one question to all of you in the divestment movement is what comes next? Let's say, just for the sake of argument, that all the Claremont colleges declare you're going to sell all your stocks in 200 companies. Then what?
I thought you were going to answer that.
It's not for me to answer. I'm not in that movement.
So Paul, your hope and aspirations were clearly on the table. Can you give me the counter to your argument?
The counter to my argument? Let me give an example of an unsuccessful movement. First of all, I want to second Professor Asher's point about the importance of institutionalizing gains. If you want to defeat a student movement, all you have to do is wait for them to graduate. Right? So 4 years in that part of your life feels like day and night. Boy, waiting 4 years when you're in midlife or older, that's not such a long time. Just wait, they'll graduate. So think about institutionalizing.
If we give them A's, they'll go soon.
It's possible. I would say an example of students and others not having an impact on the world is the peace movement, which I think was, to a significant degree, successful in ending the conflict in Vietnam, but not in putting in place any sort of real alternative. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One is when it comes to questions of defense, the expertise is much more centralized. It is much more difficult for communities like Claremont or for student clubs to speak with any authority on any aspect of national defense, precisely because so much of the information is secret. You have to be on the inside to really be an expert. I recall we brought to UC Santa Barbara in 1986 Robert Bowman, the first director of the Strategic Defense Initiative Star Wars program, who came out as an opponent to that initiative. And I recall a debate between him and a member of the UC weapons laboratories in which the UC representative said, well, Bob, you've been on the outside for a couple of years now, and we've actually made a number of developments you're not aware of when debating the feasibility. So I think it was difficult for reasons that are not present in this instance. A second reason why I think the peace movement failed is a lack of an inability to propose alternatives. There was some talk of common security, some talk of alternative world arrangements. I don't think you could possibly reduce the U.S. defense budget without having Europe take over a significant chunk of responsibility for maintaining world peace, which would require of Americans getting comfortable with the idea of having to be told what to do once in a while by our partners across the Atlantic. So that might be a counterexample of a movement that I consider largely unsuccessful, and I was, as a student, very active in that particular movement for those reasons.
So I think we have one more question I can do. Yeah. Yeah? Okay. So, Jess, what are the alternatives to play off of Paul's point, and also many of those that have come from the other people? If divestment, as you say, is a tactical move, it has a strategy, what is the thing that you're going to argue, or McKinnon will argue in terms of alternative processes?
To follow up with divestment?
Yeah.
Well, there are a number of things that can happen. In terms of divestment specifically, the alternatives that are, I think, very good options for furthering the impact of divestiture in general are creating green revolving funds for the schools, in which funds that are divested are either placed directly into a fund in which those funds would go to supply monetary support for green projects on campus, such as investing those directly into a solar array for campus, or some larger project that would actually generate returns for the campus. Another option is to have alumni donations going into that fund as well, so that there is a revolving support for green initiatives on campus. And I think that that's a really great way to make divestment more than just a political statement and start to initiate some of the clean energy initiatives that we've been talking about a little bit. There are other options as well, including buying new funds, and there are some social responsibility funds, such as the Trillium Green Century Fund, which has been fossil-free since 2005.
So we're now moving into our third section in which the panel gets to talk to each other instead of me. So if any one of you has a comment to the other, this is not the time to come out with another 5-point plan, John. Good though that might be, but really is a question. Bill.
There was some frustration expressed about Congress. It actually turns out that you can sue the U.S. government. And the way the EPA got any teeth whatsoever was that when it was founded with only a minimal budget, this was the collusion between President Nixon and Congress. We want to start something that makes it look like we're paying attention to the environment, but let's starve it for funds so that it can't actually do the testing to see what chemicals are really hazardous, which ones are not. There were lots of lawsuits that came out suing the government for nonfeasance, malfeasance, misfeasance, you name the feasance. And that was a really important initiative. Congress had to back down and fund this stuff. So they are not as powerful as you might think. If you can use some jujitsu and use the laws that are already on the books and make sure that, in fact, those laws are enacted. There are many laws on the books that are very powerful on paper. They're not enforced, the Endangered Species Act being one of them, but you do have the option of lawsuits to try to put more pressure to see that they do get enforced to a larger degree.
I guess I'd like to see more discussion of the distinction that's being drawn between divestment on the one hand and what's being cast as a more important measure, which is we need change in politics and policy. And I don't really see a distinction between those two. That is to say, if we think of this question not in the abstract of what might one do, irrespective of what one's resources are and where one is in life to affect this problem, then maybe I'd say call a meeting with Obama and, or who knows what. But as students, it occurs to me that there are a couple things we have to keep in mind. First of all is the phenomenon of momentum. So we're not asking this question in 2009. We're asking this question at a time when this train has left the station. There is a lot of movement behind it, and just one more sort of hand pushing along this stalled car on the railroad track can actually have more of an impact, I would argue, than trying to start from scratch some initiative that has not captured national attention. That does not mean one has to accept whole hog the way that it's being presented by 350.org, and I actually find very compelling the argument for a more targeted campaign, for example, that maybe could motivate. I'm not certain that companies will be motivated to change in any way by anything other than national legislation and statewide legislation, but if you're a fossil fuel company and you at least have an opportunity to be liked, then maybe there's some things you would do, whereas if no matter what you do, they're going to hate you because you're in this business, there's not much of an incentive for change within a company there.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that really quickly, if possible. Just in agreement with Professor Steinberg, I completely believe, and so does our whole divestment team, that divestment is a political action. And many of the greatest political actions have started at the grassroots level, as Professor Steinberg outlined for us previously. Divestment is already getting mentioned on a higher political level. For example, Senator Whitehouse of Rhode Island stated to Congress that this movement by students deserves significant attention. Senator Kerry himself has divested, and the political momentum continues to grow. In terms of a targeted divestment campaign to more specific companies, I can understand that argument if we felt that there was going to be more of a significant economic impact immediately to those companies. But if we're talking about creating paradigm change and making a message that we want complete freedom from this industry, that we don't want them to rule the way that we live and determine the choices that we make, then why not divest from the top 200 companies? Why focus it on the filthy 15, which many schools are doing? But I say, while we're at it, why not just do them all? Honestly, when you take a look, we don't know what's in our investment portfolios in any of these schools, first of all, because it's all, we don't have transparency. It's all complicated and mixed in there. A lot of schools, once they've finally found out what companies they're invested in, they found maybe 3 on the list of 200. So if we limit that to 15 companies, we may go in there and see none. But if we expand it to the 200, then maybe we can get at a few of them and actually make a difference.
On that point, and just to play devil's advocate here, thinking about what impact a fairly small divestment could have, it seems to me that boycotts definitely have been strongest where a company's brand has been at stake. So there, it's a matter of talking about specific companies and talking about them and their specific outlaw actions. Sectoral boycotts, I think, are harder for the public to get their mind around, especially when it's a vital input that's generating the electricity to your house. And so I think that it maybe is a harder thing to get the media to portray on the front page or near the front page to have people think about sort of outlaw company of the week. Because you do, so when it's Chevron, when it's BP, when it's Royal Dutch Shell, I mean, you actually think about the specific environmental disasters that they have been involved in, and you're able to connect the dots between their practices and the lives of very specific people. And so that, I guess, would be the opposite. I think about, say, the Pesticide Action Network and the work that they've done with Dirty Dozen pesticides. And there are way more than 12 pesticides that are persistent and they're toxic and they're a problem. But the Dirty Dozen was a particularly successful campaign in getting some of the worst pesticides off the market and getting people thinking about how a particular pesticide is harming human health and the environment. So I guess that would be just an alternative thought, not necessarily. I'm also thinking as I speak. So I think this is all about, I think, all of us reasoning through what are the best ways of directing our time and action.
Yeah, just a few things. One is, I don't want you to take anything I said as suggesting that things be somehow sequenced in time, so much as sequenced in priority. So, in my opinion, these other things are more important than divestiture. That is actually doing things, going and buying California Air Resource Board allowances, buying renewable energy credits and things like that, because they involve real sacrifice. Just to kind of make sure that everybody's on the same page in terms of the economic facts, because it would bother me if anybody's laboring under different understanding. These guys don't need you to finance it. When you go buy their stock, you're not handing them money. I think you all realize that. You're buying the stock from somebody else. They floated their stock a long time ago. In 2011, Exxon had $450 billion of revenues. They had $55 billion of net revenues. What they did with those $55 billion was they gave $9 billion to shareholders. They put $20 billion back into the company in terms of new projects, and they bought back $22 billion of stock. They're buying their own stock back. You're not going to hurt them by divesting. Now, I agree, it's a political statement. I just want to make sure you guys understand that you're not thinking about this as being some economic avenue to pinching it, because it's not going to work that way. It's all political. The other thing I think you need to understand is that, Bill McKibben talks about, well, we have to stop, we have to basically stop them from using 80% of their reserves. Well, the oil companies are not what they used to be. 70% of the reserves in the world are controlled by non-publicly traded companies, like the Saudi Aramcos of the world. So you're targeting a fairly small, I mean, it's still huge, okay, but in terms of percentage, it's not the majority of reserves in the world.
So that leads us where?
That leads us simply to I just want to make sure that everybody has that in mind, that they're not going to sometimes it seems like people are still laboring under the assumption that these big American oil companies dominate the industry. And that may have been, and probably was true, before mid-1970s, but we're in a new world, okay?
I really appreciate those insights from someone who knows a whole heck of a lot more about the finances of this particular industry than I do. Still, when I was digging around to find some of the numbers, I think perhaps there's more, call it financial potential, even if it's not as punishment of company, than we might realize. So, as many of you may know, the combined value of endowments of colleges in the United States is $400 billion, which is greater than the entire assets of ExxonMobil. Now, I agree, I'm not one to question whether the colleges are capable of bringing ExxonMobil to its knees, right? But for example, the Congressional Research Service dug around, they started interviewing companies to find out how much they actually spend on research, not just for alternatives, for everything. And the figure was about $3.5 billion. Okay, so if in fact we were to shift some money from place A to place B to support, for example, research on renewables, suddenly a small, some percentage of $400 billion in endowments seems to me to be a fairly significant sum, even just on the financials, with the important provisos that Professor Jurowitz and others are providing here. I do think there are many models of potential change for a company. One of these models is something you might call big good, big bad. So just by virtue of their size, if campaigns like this one continue to embarrass these companies so they want this problem to go away, so even though they're not going to change their bread and butter activities, they're going to keep drilling and doing what they're doing, but they need to drop some money. They need to drop some money like BP dropped $400 million for research into renewables in California. Just when you can convince a large organization to do something to try and make this problem go away, it can in and of itself be significant. Even if they consider it token money, even if they're sort of laughing around their conference table, it can actually be significant. The World Bank reforms are a classic case of this, where in response to protests within primarily the United States about World Bank lending practices, the World Bank didn't fundamentally alter its mission. However, it directed a lot of money toward environmental protection, such that the World Bank is the largest funder in the world of biodiversity protection, bar none. They have spent hundreds of billions of dollars on that over the last 20 years. So another of, I think, many potential models of change here is what I would call the good, big, big good, big bad sort of model, where maybe we can't stop them from doing their bad activities, but could perhaps inspire some sort of greater commitment to doing the right thing, which would be trivial by their standards, but by virtue of their size, would be non-trivial by our standards. Thank you.
So now we're going to open it up for you. Because we want to make sure you guys have some time for questions for the panel. So this room is small enough that normally you can just raise your hand and speak loudly, and you're heard just fine. But you can also come to the podium if you have a soft voice. And Char's going to take your turn.
Yes. So far, the conversation seems to have been split into two major arguments. We've heard a lot of the argument for why it's not a successful economic campaign and possibly why it could be if we change where we're investing. I feel that largely you can ignore the social implications of this. We already have evidence that major news corporations, etc., are taking up some interest in this campaign, regardless of whether or not it's going to be portrayed in the best light. I think there is a tangible impact of the fact that by divesting from this direction, making a statement, and that I feel it has a much wider social implication than what we've been getting at. Of course, yes, we can change our, invest our time politically and have Congress change, but I think there's also much wider societal change that this can help influence. And it's not quite as easy of a way of putting our time in, we can vote, but we can't necessarily change the societal perception of something unless we do a symbolic act, more like what we're doing here. So I'd like to hear what your opinions are on the potential societal implications rather than the political ones.
One of my reactions is I want to convince myself that this isn't just going to contribute to the culture wars, where it basically just divides society more. And there'll certainly be people that will be trying to use it in that particular way. On the other hand, if you believe, and you may believe, and there's a basis for believing this, that if this initiative actually kickstart federal movement towards cap and trade, for instance, or a carbon tax. I've talked to plenty of people in the industry, and after being, and I've been in these sessions with them at Resources for the Future, very interesting sessions, talking about the pros and cons of cap and trade versus taxes. And at the end of the day, these guys throw up their hands and say, give me taxes. It's interesting, but so anyway, if this movement can be used to make something happen in Congress, then great. If it also can be used to mobilize people at a grassroots level to do things themselves, like I was talking about in terms of actually trying to decarbonize their own world, then that's great too.
Just to respond quickly as well, could all of you who hadn't heard of the Copenhagen Accord limit to 2-degree global temperature increase before this movement began, or even before tonight, could you raise your hand, please? If you had not heard of the 2-degree limit on global temperature increase before this movement, so that's a fair number of you. This movement is meant not only to initiate political change, but also to create a public discourse, as I mentioned before, about the real issue at stake here. People are starting to become familiar with the issue of climate change, and they're starting to realize this is serious shit, excuse my French. But I don't think that the general public is aware of really the measures that need to be taken. 2-degree increase, that is a solid number. That is something that is more tangible than our world is going to get really hot. People, it's hard to quantify that in your head.
And that's Celsius.
That's Celsius. So that's like, that's different. It's different than Fahrenheit.
That's French.
In terms of the economic effect and also tied up the political effect as well, the HBSC report warns investors that 40 to 60% of leading fossil fuel firms' current market capitalization could be at risk if the international community sticks to its commitment to limit global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. So if this becomes an issue of social morality and political action, it really could have a long-lasting impact that could initiate some real change.
I guess the question is, what does come next? And if you want to make a societal change and make people more aware, then what's the transition from riding around in automobiles, even electric automobiles, after all, electricity has to be produced somehow. In fact, it's more likely that electricity is produced through coal than through gasoline. So what's your transition theory on this? Social change works if there are avenues to exercise, to manifest those social changes. I was at a meeting in Denver, which is one of the energy capitals of America now. And one of the speakers from a large energy company said that natural gas is the transition fuel. And it has a lot of advantages over coal and oil, but it's a hydrocarbon. And that's going to be our fuel for the next 20 years. And it's much better than those other hydrocarbon alternatives, especially coal. But that doesn't get you to the root of your problem. You don't want any hydrocarbons. So what do? Not go in an automobile? Not turn on the lights? How, you know, there's this concept in psychology of cognitive dissonance, where there are two different beliefs that are inconsistent with one another, and something has to give. So you tell people hydrocarbon industries are bad, the use of their products is bad, but they still have to go in the car and have the lights on. Something's going to go. What's going to go is the rejection of what you're arguing, because they're still going to ride around in cars. So you really have to have some transitional strategy, and I haven't heard it articulated yet.
Another question, yes, please.
Well, Well, I guess one place that I think I'd like to see this discussion go with all of you guys sitting here is that it seems that this obviously sort of wants to gravitate towards some kind of, excellent solution, and where we can all figure out, like what are our transition strategies and where to go. But I remember at the beginning, you brought up how this is sort of this campaign is born of political frustration. And I guess my question is, given that 4 out of the 5 Cs are already committed to this president's climate commitment, which all of them have said we agree to be carbon neutral by X date. For Pittsburgh it's 2050, I think. It's been a little bit lax about filings reports, but it's kind of like their signatures on paper somewhere, and they've all agreed to do this. And so, given what that means for these colleges, my question is, where in the future do we get to divestment and say, oh, we're not going to do that? Is divestment a thing? Is divestment by any means a thing that shouldn't happen? Shouldn't it just be easy? If you just tell someone get our funds out of here. I guess what are the difficulties of divestment that we have to have this calendar? We have to get a signature from every student of the 5 colleges.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's that easy. I think the structure of long-term pool investment for the endowment is complex, and so you have large mutual funds that may have holdings in fossil fuels, and so there's a certain model of investing, right, that's been developed over time. And you also have to consider the fiduciary commitment of trustees. They don't own the college, they're trustees of the college, and by law, they are obliged to serve the mission of the college. And the college has a lot of things that it needs to do. It needs to fund its operations, it needs to pay for financial aid, it needs to pay salaries, a lot of other things. And so it's actually a really complicated thing to do to just say, oh, we'll divest. I think that there are some colleges that have jumped to say that they'll do this, but they've been actually very vague about the details. And as I understand it, it's not so easy. So I guess my feeling is that understanding the complexity of managing a very large amount of money with needs to have gains 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now is complicated, and it's worth learning about and trying to engage the trustees in this, because many of you will be working in organizations that similarly have large investments of pension funds and so forth, and so it's worth actually getting into the details of this. And so for that reason, I think that it's important to understand that the trustees, certainly at Pomona College, I think they all believe the science of climate change, and nobody's profiting from the prospect of climate change. So beginning with the belief that we share this future, we share values, and trying to find the grounds by which you can actually sit down and understand the complexity of this, educate people about that, and then think about what kind of time and energy it would take to come up with a model that still allows trustees to fulfill their obligations to the college while aligning the portfolio more closely with people's shared values. It's really tedious and hard, and it involves a lot of careful diplomacy and making alliances before you make enemies. And there's a point to that, but it's really tedious, careful work. And there's also, I think you talked about the importance of media coverage on this. And so media aren't going to be covering careful inside, closed door meetings where you're going over some confidential financial information and learning this information. So I actually see that there's a real tension between A, wanting to get the New York Times to talk about this, and B, actually wanting to achieve your objective, which is a long-term viable divestment strategy that still maintains all 5 colleges as institutions fulfilling public mission. So that's my feeling.
One thing you guys have to do, it seems to me, is push for transparency. I mean, I haven't had any discussion with trustees, and part of the process has got to be to do that. and see why we don't have transparency. Maybe they've got some good reasons. I'm not talking about transparency day to day so you can front run what they're out trying to buy. Okay? I'm talking about, I mean, even a normal financial institution has got that actually holds itself out to the public has got to file a report every 3 months indicating what it holds. It doesn't have to make reports in the meantime because everybody knows it's out there jockeying around and they understand that they can't be disadvantaged. But on a quarterly basis, you find out exactly what these funds are invested in. Now, maybe we don't need it quarterly, but it seems to me we at least need it annually and maybe semi-annually. And I don't really understand, and I'm willing to listen, to why we don't have transparency. Now, Heather's absolutely right. We have to be sensitive. These guys have fiduciary duties. They have legal duties that they're sworn to. But, you know, and she also mentioned the vehicles. We need to find out exactly what vehicles they're in. Are they in individual stocks? If they're in individual stocks, mostly, I think those things are very easily rearranged. I can substitute Procter & Gamble for Exxon. It's not exactly the same. I recognize that, but you don't lose a hell of a lot. I know enough about financial theory to know that. Okay, anytime you constrain yourself, you're not going to be able to do as well. But I don't think that's much of a constraint. But there's also problems in terms of going into more venture capitalism, capitalist stuff, and renewables. And maybe their fiduciary duty really does truly limit their ability to rebalance the portfolio in that way. But I think there may be other avenues. Set up a separate fund. Seek alumni contributions to a renewables fund. If it's got to be 2 funds, because people have already made donations based upon, you know, these guys are only going to go out and you know, invest in quadruple A securities, then I understand. If that was a fiduciary understanding when people gave them the money, then they better stick to it. But we can set up a separate fund with different objectives.
Of course, the limitation of setting up a separate fund is that money's fungible. So these guys want to balance it because of their fiduciary responsibilities. So if Exxon isn't in the special fund, Exxon may pop up in the other fund. That's the risk, if you're really interested in divesting.
We're having this talk in 2012, and it's been, you know, an ongoing discussion. And some have said that, sorry, 2013.
It's ongoing already.
2013. I mean, I think this conversation is long overdue, and the world's global system is changing, climate change is rapidly occurring, positive feedback loops, etc. from a biological perspective. But what, in your opinion, politically, economically, should the president do first? Should Congress act first to limit and mitigate the changes that are already happening? Because time is now. Time is digress.
Ignoring the politics, adopt a combination of a carbon tax and cap and trade.
I agree with that. I'm a fan of the carbon tax. One option to make it more politically palatable would be proposing a revenue neutral carbon tax, which of course wouldn't take care of the revenue needed for the government. But if you were to put a tax on greenhouse gas emissions, and then the price is reflected in the market, then essentially all of the revenues collected for that would then be split up and sent back to taxpayers at the end of the year. So if you're living a really carbon smart lifestyle, you'll make a profit. If you are living a profligate lifestyle with 3 Hummers, etc., you will pay a lot in net taxes to the system. So it's a redistributive system that helps send a message to people, A, how carbon intensive a good or service is, and B, it also sends a personal signal to you as to how carbon smart you are. So that's one idea that has been floated out there.
Use the balanced budget.
I'd also like to add to that, to reject the Keystone XL pipeline.
Bill, do you have anything to add?
Not at this time.
I would add the importance of not overlooking state governments. We are not France or Germany or Norway trying to figure out how to do this. They don't have federalist systems we do. So we have serious regulatory authority vested at state levels. California has adopted a plan for addressing climate change that is every bit as aggressive as that of Europe. So California resembles Germany more so than it does Washington, D.C. And by the way, Spain resembles, what would it be, maybe Idaho more than the United States, than the European Union. So we should look at the state levels, and I would say state government within Sacramento is potentially more porous, more subject to student influence than is the capital in Washington, D.C. That system, of course, is broken. It's broken in large part because of money, to give you a sense of the money. The 10th, let's see, from 1998 to 2012, ExxonMobil was the 10th largest in terms of expenditures on lobbying. They spent $179 million lobbying during that period. And actually the top, and you can imagine that Exxon and the other oil companies contribute to this, was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that contributed $900 million to lobbying activities during that period of time. So that system, unfortunately, I certainly wouldn't give up hope, and I believe that a nationwide movement can, in many ways, make it easier for national policymakers to move, as well as more difficult for oil companies to oppose them. But I wouldn't want to overlook statewide initiatives. And by the way, when the oil companies tried to overturn Assembly Bill 32, California's climate change law, with that recent Proposition 23, according to the co-chairman of the opposition to 23, the one who wanted to keep in place our climate change law, he said one reason I think that we won is that there were a lot of other energy companies that might have wanted to try and overturn this law, but they didn't want to show their face. That they didn't want to be publicly embarrassed, they didn't want to be tagged as the bad guy. In other words, to the extent that initiatives like this create a general social atmosphere that makes it difficult for corporations to move with impunity to do things like, what General Motors did to Los Angeles. You want to know what General Motors did to Los Angeles? You used to be able to take light rail from here to the beach, right? They created a front company, a bus company. They bought up all the rails in Los Angeles and other cities throughout the United States, and they literally set them on fire. I have the photos in one of my PowerPoint classroom settings. And this also speaks to an earlier point regarding